The recent federal decision to deploy 2,000 National Guard troops to support operations at U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement (ICE) detention facilities marks a significant turning point in American immigration policy. Framed as an emergency logistical support measure, this deployment has triggered legal, ethical, political, and humanitarian concerns. On the surface, the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, argues that the use of National Guard personnel will alleviate administrative and operational burdens on ICE agents, allowing them to focus on arrest and deportation operations. However, critics argue that this move reflects a deeper trend toward the militarization of civil immigration enforcement, reminiscent of wartime tactics rather than a humane approach to managing asylum and migration. This report provides an in-depth investigation into the underlying legal structures that make such a deployment possible, examining both constitutional constraints and loopholes in immigration enforcement practices. It also explores how the Posse Comitatus Act, traditionally a safeguard against military intervention in domestic affairs, is being sidestepped through the National Guard's dual federal-state role. The deployment brings new urgency to long-standing debates about conditions in ICE detention facilities already under fire for overcrowding, medical neglect, and inadequate legal access. The presence of armed or uniformed military forces is likely to exacerbate detainees' trauma and may further isolate facilities from public accountability. Politically, the move is being praised by immigration hardliners as a bold and necessary step to restore order, while being condemned by civil rights advocates, immigration lawyers, and progressive lawmakers as a dangerous overreach. The National Guard's involvement in ICE operations is expected to spark both lawsuits and protests with implications for future administrations. Moreover, this decision arrives amid a volatile moment in global migration history, where war, climate change, and economic instability are driving record levels of displacement. The optics of the U.S., a traditional symbol of refuge deploying troops inside detention centers, will reverberate far beyond its borders. As this report will show, this move is not an isolated decision, but part of a broader historical pattern. From Operation Wetback in the 1950s to post-9/11's border fortification strategies, the U.S. has frequently fluctuated between humanitarian immigration policy and hardline enforcement. While the administration insists the National Guard will not perform arrests or engage in direct enforcement, the boundaries between support and enforcement are not always clear. Without rigorous oversight, there is a risk of mission creep where soldiers gradually assume roles once reserved for law enforcement officers. This report concludes that the deployment reflects a strategic escalation of immigration control, not just a temporary logistical measure. It is a signal that the federal government is prioritizing detention and deportation over comprehensive immigration reform, due process, or humane alternatives such as community-based supervision programs. In the sections that follow, this report will present a deep dive into the legal authorities underpinning this deployment, a breakdown of National Guard responsibilities and potential overreach, first-hand accounts and case studies of prior military involvement in immigration enforcement, reactions from political stakeholders across the spectrum, and long-term projections of what this means for democracy, civil liberties, and America's place in the world. The recommendation, ultimately, is for Congress to establish clear guardrails around military involvement in immigration to prevent the further erosion of civilian oversight. Without such action, the precedent set by this deployment could reshape the fabric of U.S. immigration enforcement and domestic military use for years to come. U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, is a powerful agency under the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, established in 2003 following the 9/11 attacks. It was created as part of the government's reshaping of national security infrastructure and has since become the central arm of interior immigration enforcement. ICE's mission is multifaceted, encompassing identification and removal of undocumented immigrants, investigating customs violations, conducting raids and deportation operations, managing detention centers across the country. While U.S. Customs and Border Protection, CBP, handles border security, ICE oversees the interior, often conducting operations in urban areas, workplaces, and even homes. Its activities have consistently been the subject of controversy, particularly due to reports of family separation, medical negligence in detention, use of private for-profit detention companies, lack of transparency and oversight. As of 2025, ICE operates a network of over 200 detention centers, both publicly and privately run, with daily detainee populations ranging from 25,000 to 55,000. These numbers fluctuate based on policy priorities, border crossings, and enforcement discretion. In recent years, the U.S. has experienced periodic surges in migrant arrivals, especially from Latin America, Haiti, West Africa, and Asia. These movements are often driven by political instability, e.g. Venezuela, Honduras, natural disasters, e.g. hurricanes, droughts, gang violence and corruption, economic collapse. While many migrants seek asylum, ICE's expanding mandate has led to a detain first, process later approach. Detention is often used pre-trial before migrants receive asylum hearings or legal review. This has created enormous pressure on ICE detention capacity. The agency has responded by increasing contracts with private prison companies, e.g. GO Group, Core Civic, reopening defunct facilities, expanding makeshift and temporary housing, requesting military support to manage overflow and operations. The latest decision to deploy 2,000 National Guard troops must be understood as a response to both a logistical crisis and a political strategy. The National Guard is a unique branch of the U.S. Armed Forces. Unlike active duty military, the Guard operates under a dual command structure. State authority. Governors can activate the Guard for domestic emergencies like hurricanes, civil unrest, and wildfires. Federal authority. The President can federalize the Guard under Title 10 of the U.S. Code during national emergencies or to support federal missions. This duality allows for flexible deployment, which is why federal agencies often rely on National Guard troops in legally gray areas like immigration enforcement. Guardsmen are typically not permitted to perform law enforcement duties unless explicitly authorized by law or the President. Instead, their role is often framed as support or logistics. However, the lines between support and direct enforcement can blur in practice. The use of troops in immigration contexts is not new. Notable examples include a. Operation Gatekeeper, 1994, 1998. This Clinton-era operation deployed Border Patrol officers and military-grade surveillance at the San Diego border to curb illegal crossings. B. Operation Jump Start, 2006-2008. President George W. Bush ordered 6,000 National Guard troops to the U.S.-Mexico border. Their duties included construction, surveillance, and administrative support. C. Operation Phalanx, 2010. Under President Obama, National Guard air support and radar tracking were used along the southern border in coordination with DHS. D. Trump-era deployments, 2018, 2021. In response to migrant caravans, the Trump administration deployed thousands of National Guard troops and active duty personnel to border zones. They supported CBP but were criticized for militarizing humanitarian issues. What makes the 2025 deployment distinct is that the National Guard is not being stationed at the border, but within ICE detention facilities, which raises new ethical and operational concerns. While official statements claim the deployment is temporary and meant to relieve administrative burdens, sources within DHS suggest a more strategic intent. Surge in migrant detentions following policy changes and border arrests, strain on ICE's workforce, especially after budget reallocations and agent attrition. Escalation of enforcement operations, including mass raids and workplace sweeps, preparation for expanded deportation campaigns requiring back-end detention capacity. By deploying the Guard, the administration is replacing civilian or contractor roles with military personnel, expanding processing speed and facility control, sending a strong political signal about the seriousness of its immigration crackdown. ICE detention centers have long drawn criticism from human rights organizations, e.g., Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, legal advocates, e.g., ACLU, National Immigration Justice Center, medical professionals, e.g., Physicians for Human Rights, United Nations Special Rapporteurs. Common issues include lack of medical care, leading to preventable deaths, unsanitary conditions, and poor nutrition, inadequate legal access, especially in rural or remote locations, abuse allegations, including solitary confinement and sexual misconduct. Introducing military troops into these spaces may exacerbate fear and reduce transparency. Unlike civilian contractors or nonprofit observers, military units are not typically trained in trauma-informed care, language interpretation for asylum claims, child protection protocols. This further raises concerns about how detainees, many of whom are not criminals, but asylum seekers, will be treated. The deployment is also deeply political. In an election cycle, immigration becomes a flashpoint issue. Key narratives include restoring control at the border, protecting American jobs, combating crime and gang activity, responding to fentanyl smuggling, often blamed, sometimes inaccurate line immigrants. For the administration, military deployment is a way to signal strength and resolve to its political base, silence critics of open border policies, distract from legislative failures to pass immigration reform. For opponents, the deployment is evidence of executive overreach, use of fear tactics, erosion of civil liberties, transformation of a civil issue into a military operation. Civil society organizations, immigrant rights groups, and legal watchdogs have already begun filing challenges or preparing legal action. Expected developments include Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, requests to reveal internal communications, injunctions in federal court to halt military involvement, state-level lawsuits from governors or attorneys general opposing the deployment. At the same time, affected communities, particularly near detention centers, may see protests and demonstrations, increased police surveillance, public fear, especially among mixed-status families. Local officials have mixed responses. Some governors support the move, others denounce it as militarizing migration. Conclusion of Section 2. The deployment of 2,000 National Guard troops to ICE detention facilities is not simply a matter of resource allocation, it is a deeply symbolic and strategic shift. It reflects the growing entanglement between immigration control and national security strategy, blending civilian and military spheres in unprecedented ways. This context sets the stage for a broader analysis of the legal, humanitarian, and political implications explored in the following chapters. The deployment of National Guard troops to ICE detention centers will not go unnoticed on the global stage. Human rights organizations and international bodies such as the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, may issue formal condemnations or investigative calls. Key concerns raised by the international community may include violation of the right to seek asylum, particularly under the 1951 Refugee Convention, inhumane or degrading treatment of detainees, especially children, lack of transparency and due process, use of military forces in civilian detention spaces, which can be interpreted as a form of militarized suppression of vulnerable populations. The Biden and Trump administrations have both faced scrutiny at various points for U.S. treatment of migrants, especially concerning family separation. This current action may add another chapter to the global critique of U.S. immigration policy. Numerous legal battles are likely to emerge. Civil rights lawsuits. Legal aid organizations may argue the deployment violates constitutional protections, including Fourth Amendment, unreasonable search, Zeicher, Fifth Amendment, due process, Eighth Amendment, cruel and unusual punishment, 14th Amendment, equal protection. Challenges to federal authority. States that oppose the deployment might sue, arguing improper federal use of state-controlled troops, abuse of executive authority under Title 32 or emergency declarations, lack of congressional authorization, immigrant advocacy litigation. Lawsuits may aim to improve detention conditions, block further troop expansion, demand greater transparency and oversight. Organizations such as the ACLU, Southern Poverty Law Center, and National Immigration Law Center are likely to be central players. The deployment also raises questions about state versus federal control. Governors typically must approve Title 32 deployments. Will all states comply? What happens if a governor refuses to send National Guard troops? Potential showdown between the executive branch and state governments could lead to court orders, defunding threats, or political retaliation. This could strain the cooperative federalism model that underpins National Guard operations, leading to fractured responses and partisan divides. This operation could set precedents that last far beyond this administration. Possible shifts include increased normalization of military support in immigration operations, creation of a standing ICE support force of National Guard troops, budget shifts favoring enforcement and detention over humanitarian aid, legal resources, or integration services, diminishing the civilian character of immigration oversight, replacing it with military-adjacent framework. Additionally, we may see ICE increasing public-private partnerships with defense contractors, expanding militarized detention infrastructure, piloting military-grade surveillance tools for interior enforcement. This turns immigration policy into a national security project rather than a humanitarian and legal process. The deployment of 2,000 National Guard troops to ICE detention facilities is more than a tactical maneuver, it is a strategic statement. It signals that the U.S. government is willing to expand military involvement in domestic immigration enforcement. Enforcement and detention remain core pillars of policy rather than reform or integration. The lines between civilian policy and military force are increasingly blurred. In doing so, it risks dehumanizing immigrants and asylum seekers, triggering constitutional crises over executive power, damaging U.S. credibility as a defender of democratic and humanitarian norms. At a time of rising global migration and refugee displacement, America's decision to reinforce its detention infrastructure with troops will be remembered as either a necessary crisis response or a dangerous militarization of civil policy.